March 1944, the island of Luzon. The jungle was alive that night, not with wind, but with whispers. 120 U.S. Rangers lay in the mud, motionless, their faces streaked with sweat and earth. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick as smoke. Somewhere ahead, through the vines and darkness, came the faint click of a bayonet locking into place. They were surrounded. Japanese troops, nearly 500 strong, moved silently through the undergrowth, fanning out in a wide circle. Every leaf crackled underfoot. Every breath felt like betrayal. The Rangers didn't fire. Not yet. They'd come here to bait the enemy in, to hold their ground until the last possible second. Each man knew the plan. Wait until they were close enough to see the whites of their eyes. And then, unleash hell. A flare burst overhead. The night turned white. Dozens of Japanese soldiers charged, shouting through the trees. The first line never reached the foxholes. The second vanished under machine gun fire. 30 minutes later, the jungle was quiet again, except for the hiss of steam rising from 500 bodies. To understand that night on Luzon and why 100 Fakin, 20 leaders, American Rangers would ever allow themselves to be surrounded, you have to go back to the desperate months before it. By early 1944, the Pacific War had turned, but the fighting had not softened. The United States was clawing its way through a chain of islands that Japan had spent years fortifying. From New Guinea to the Philippines, the terrain was unforgiving. Dense jungle, mud, malaria, and an enemy that refused to surrender. This was not Europe, where battles were fought across fields and towns. Here, war lived in the trees. The jungle swallowed sound, light, and blood alike. A man could vanish 3 feet from his comrade. The Japanese had perfected the art of invisibility, moving in silence, striking in waves, and melting away before dawn. Against them, the U.S. Army needed a new kind of soldier. In late 1943, Colonel Henry Mucci took command of a young, untested unit, the 6th Ranger Battalion. Their orders were simple and impossible. Fight where no one else can. They trained in the swamps of Florida and the mountains of New Guinea, learning to move through jungle like water. Fast, unseen, lethal. They learned to set traps, ambush patrols, and disappear before the enemy could react. They carried light packs, short rations, and every bullet they could load. They were expected to hold out without support, to turn small numbers into sudden devastation. By the time the Rangers landed on Luzon, they had already earned a quiet reputation. They weren't numerous, but they were everywhere. Shadows that struck with surgical precision. In March 1944, intelligence reached headquarters that a large Japanese column, possibly a full battalion, was moving through the mountains west of the Rangers' position. Rather than retreat, Mucci saw an opportunity. He knew his men couldn't outrun an enemy that size, but they could outthink them. Using terrain reconnaissance, he selected a narrow valley cut by streams and thick jungle canopy. There, the Rangers would dig shallow foxholes and machine gun nests, using fallen trees as cover. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Let the enemy find them. Let them believe the Rangers were trapped. Then make the jungle itself explode. For 2 days, the men prepared in silence. They cut lanes of fire through the brush, buried tripwires, and coordinated overlapping arcs for their .30 caliber Brownings and bars. Ammunition belts were stacked like sandbags. They had no heavy artillery, no armor, no air cover, just rifles, grenades, and patience. By the evening of March 15th, Japanese scouts had spotted their position. Reports indicated 400 to 500 enemy troops advancing from 3 sides. The Rangers knew what was coming and didn't move an inch. Night fell like a curtain. The jungle grew restless. Insects hummed louder than gunfire. The men lay still, their faces painted black, eyes fixed on the darkness. Private James McGuire, who later wrote about that night, said, "We could hear them whispering to each other. We could smell the tobacco on their breath. I remember thinking, if I can smell them, they're already dead." By dawn, the trap was set. The Japanese had completed their circle. From a distance, it looked like 120 Americans were doomed, surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off. But in reality, it was the other way around. They had walked straight into an invisible fortress, one built not with walls, but with will. The Japanese attack plan was classic Imperial Army doctrine, a tactic born from the jungles of Burma and the mountains of New Guinea. Isolate, encircle, annihilate. To them, the Americans were a cornered animal, and a cornered animal panics. In every Japanese field manual of the war, encirclement was taught as both a physical and psychological weapon. The goal was not just to trap, but to break will. The moment soldiers realized they were surrounded, confusion and fear would do the rest. What the Japanese didn't understand that morning on Luzon was that these 120 Rangers were trained. For this exact moment, Colonel Mucci and his officers had studied Japanese attack patterns for months. They knew that the enemy preferred frontal charges at dawn, preceded by snipers and grenadiers crawling ahead through cover. They knew Japanese officers led from the front, waving swords, shouting orders, which made them perfect targets for riflemen with steady nerves. And most of all, they knew that Japanese morale depended on momentum. Once a charge stalled, panic spread faster than bullets. So, the Rangers built their defense around stillness. They dug in along a shallow ridge, with machine gun crews positioned behind interlocking kill zones. A hidden mortar team sat near the rear, its tubes buried under wet camouflage. Snipers marked their firing lanes with strips of cloth tied around roots. Each man had pre-measured distances, memorized where to aim before the enemy even appeared. The jungle was their ally now. At first light, the Japanese moved. They came through the trees in disciplined silence, their bayonets glinting in the weak dawn. The Rangers heard them long before they saw them. Boots in mud, the soft click of safety catches being switched off. Through the dense foliage, shadows moved like waves. The first exchange was a whisper of gunfire. A single Ranger taking out a point scout with a suppressed carbine. Then silence again. The Japanese pressed forward. By 0700 hours, the encirclement was complete. A captured map later showed that their commanders believed the Rangers were trapped inside a kill pocket. In reality, it was the opposite. The Americans had engineered a reverse ambush. Inside that perimeter, discipline held like iron. No one fired without command. Men watched their sights until their eyes burned. Even as enemy patrols passed within 10 yards, no one moved. The Japanese, convinced they had surprise, kept creeping inward. It was exactly what the Rangers wanted. By 07th team, the jungle trembled with anticipation. The enemy was in range, hundreds of them crouched and ready to rush. In that breathless moment before chaos, Sergeant Joe Schaefer whispered to his team, "Remember your lanes. Don't waste bullets. The jungle will take care of the rest." Then the first bugle sounded, sharp, distant, defiant, and the war began. A single flare went up, bursting above the canopy in white fire. The Japanese charged from every direction, shouting as they came. To most men, it would have sounded like the end. To the Rangers, it sounded like opportunity. Every gun opened at once. Machine gun tracers cut the fog in red ribbons. Mortars exploded in the tree line. Grenades sailed into clusters of running soldiers and detonated with wet thunder. The Japanese advance folded almost instantly. Those behind kept running, unable to see through the smoke, tripping over their fallen comrades. The Rangers didn't cheer, didn't shout. They just fired, reloaded, and fired again. Within minutes, the air was thick with dust and blood. Branches burned, leaves fell like rain. The smell of cordite hung heavy over everything. When the first assault broke, the Japanese regrouped. They didn't retreat. They never did. They adjusted formation, tried again. But this time, the Americans were ready for every step. Each charge was met with layered fire. Short, precise bursts, never wasted. Within 30 minutes, the valley had turned into a graveyard. The men of the 6th Ranger Battalion had done the impossible. They had invited the storm and survived it. For the men in those foxholes, the battle did not feel like glory. It felt like eternity compressed into half an hour. Inside the perimeter, Rangers crouched behind their shallow cover, sweat running down their necks, hearts pounding against their helmets. The noise was beyond description. The crash of rifles, the tearing roar of Brownings, the deafening echo of grenades bursting only yards away. They could see faces now, Japanese soldiers sprinting through the smoke, some screaming, others utterly silent. The jungle swallowed the sound and spat it back as chaos. Every second, the world exploded, then fell into stillness, then exploded again. Fear was constant, but it had no room to breathe. Every man focused on the next reload, the next target, the next breath. Sergeant John Rika, firing one of the heavy Brownings, later said, "You didn't think about dying. You thought about keeping the gun running." Discipline had replaced instinct. When the first wave fell, there was no relief, only the next one. When magazines ran dry, Rangers passed ammunition by hand, crawling under fire to keep the belts feeding. They fired until the barrels glowed red, then swapped them out barehanded, their palms blistering. In that madness, training took over. Every drill, every order barked back in camp had been for this. They were surrounded, but not alone. Each man's survival depended entirely on the man beside him, and that trust was absolute. Private Leo Perez recalled later, "You stopped hearing the shots. You only heard the man next to you breathing. As long as he was there, you kept fighting." The fight was not about courage. It was about rhythm. Fire, reload, breathe. Fire, reload, breathe. The human machine running alongside the mechanical one. When the smoke finally began to clear, most didn't realize it was over. They kept their sights fixed forward, fingers on the trigger, expecting the next rush. For them, time had vanished. Only the instinct to survive remained. And somehow, that was enough. What the Rangers achieved that morning was not luck. It was mathematics. Their formation, a tight horseshoe with interlocking fire zones, had been calculated to trap the Japanese momentum. Colonel Mucci and his officers had predicted where the enemy would strike, how they would regroup, and where the terrain would funnel them. Every shot the Rangers fired had purpose. Machine guns controlled the open flanks, forcing the enemy into narrow approaches where riflemen waited. Mortars dropped shells just behind the advancing line, cutting off retreat. Grenadiers aimed for sound, not sight, throwing where the noise of movement was loudest. The Japanese attacked with courage, but courage could not outfight geometry. The Rangers' discipline, their refusal to panic, was what made the trap work. Most armies, when surrounded, fired in every direction, wasting ammunition and giving away positions. These men did the opposite. They waited, holding their fire until the Japanese were within 20 yards. Only then did they open up, maximizing shock and minimizing risk. Their weapons were chosen for that precision. The M1 Garand, semi-automatic, reliable, powerful, allowed them to fire twice as fast as the enemy's bolt-action Arisaka rifles. The bars gave each squad suppressive strength that could tear through brush and armor alike. And when the charges came close, they used WW2 grenades like artillery, rolling them down slopes or lobbing them into trees to detonate above ground. Every Ranger fought not as an individual, but as a moving part of a larger system. In the post-battle analysis, officers would later calculate that the Rangers fired fewer than 10,000 rounds in total, a fraction of what most engagements consumed, yet inflicted 5 times their number in enemy casualties. It was not only efficiency, it was mastery. The Japanese never realized how completely they had been outthought. Their doctrine relied on shock, but when the enemy refused to break, shock became suicide. In that sense, the battle on Luzon was more than a firefight. It was a clash between two philosophies: unyielding aggression against controlled precision. And that day, precision won. The jungle had become a laboratory of war, and the men inside it, both predator and prey, had rewritten its rules. The Rangers' greatest weapon wasn't their numbers. It was their mastery of technology adapted to chaos. Every weapon they carried had a purpose, and every shot they fired exploited a piece of American ingenuity designed for moments exactly like this. The heart of their firepower lay in the M1919 Browning .30 caliber machine gun, a weapon that could spit 500 rounds per minute with devastating precision. Positioned along the ridges and crossfires, these guns formed the backbone of the perimeter. In the open jungle, they became scythes of lead, cutting through the fog and bodies alike. Supporting them were Browning automatic rifles, BRs, portable, heavy-hitting, and brutally effective at short range. A single bar gunner could hold off an entire squad. Their rhythm filled the spaces between machine gun bursts, giving the illusion of a never-ending wall of fire. Behind them, a handful of men worked the 60mm mortars, firing at ranges they couldn't see, guided only by the sound of battle. The shells burst in airbursts just beyond the enemy's reach. The psychological weapon of choice. Each explosion echoed through the trees, bouncing in all directions, disorienting the Japanese who couldn't tell where the fire came from. It was a perfect blend of human skill and mechanical efficiency. Every trigger pull was a calculation. Every weapon complemented another. Even the Rangers' small arms, the M1 Garand, became legendary that day. Semi-automatic and nearly indestructible, it gave each rifleman 8 rapid shots before reloading, while Japanese soldiers struggled with slower, bolt-action Arisakas. In close-quarters combat, that difference meant life or death. The Japanese had numbers, courage, and discipline. But they were fighting men who had mastered the rhythm of machines. To the Japanese commander leading that battalion, the situation had seemed simple. A few dozen Americans trapped in the jungle, tired, isolated, cut off from supply. He believed they would panic, scatter, and fall apart like so many others had before. But when the first charge met the Rangers' perimeter, that confidence turned to confusion. His men advanced through smoke and vines, expecting screams and retreat. Instead, they met silence. A silence broken only by the deliberate, controlled roar of American fire. The pattern made no sense. These were not soldiers in disarray. They were machines of war, each weapon overlapping the next. The Japanese ranks fell by the dozens before they even reached the foxholes. Those who survived the first charge tried to flank and walked straight into mortars. For the first time, The Japanese soldiers felt something new in this campaign: helplessness. One captured survivor would later tell interrogators, "We thought we had them surrounded, but the Americans, they had surrounded us." The battlefield became an inversion of everything they knew about jungle warfare. Their aggression, once their advantage, became their downfall. Their courage met not panic, but precision. When the second wave faltered, Japanese officers ordered a banzai charge, an act of defiance as much as desperation. Hundreds surged forward with bayonets fixed. The jungle shook with their cries. But the Rangers had been waiting for that too. At 20 yards, the Americans opened fire again. Machine guns tore into the oncoming wall of men. It lasted less than 2 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the charge was gone. From that moment on, Japanese survivors would remember the battle not as a fight, but as a reckoning. When the guns fell silent, the Rangers didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They just sat there, listening to the jungle burn. The human cost of victory was written all around them. Bodies lay tangled in roots and vines. The air reeked of gunpowder and earth. The same hands that had pulled triggers now trembled from exhaustion. They had won, but at a cost no one could calculate in medals. In their debriefing later that week, Colonel Mucci wrote, "No one smiled. The men did what they had to. Then they just stared into the trees." War had stripped victory of joy. It had left only survival, and the heavy silence that comes after too much noise. Yet, in that silence, something powerful remained. The Rangers had proven that discipline could triumph over desperation, that intellect could outmatch aggression, and that 120 men, steady and unbroken, could stand against 5 times their number and walk away. It wasn't arrogance that followed them from Luzon. It was respect for their own endurance, for the courage of the enemy, and for the unforgiving truth of combat. That in war, the loudest victories are often the quietest ones. The first light of dawn crept through the trees like smoke. Mist clung to the ground, curling around the foxholes and the motionless Rangers who waited inside them. Each man knew the plan. Each knew this was the moment the jungle would ignite. Then came the first sound, the hollow blare of a Japanese bugle. Out of the mist, the shapes appeared. Lines of soldiers, bayonets fixed, moving at a jog. Their uniforms were soaked, their faces streaked with sweat and mud. Behind them came more, hundreds more. They carried machine guns, mortars, and rifles. The entire ridge seemed to move. The Rangers watched in silence. Fingers tightened on triggers. The order was simple and absolute: hold fire. At 20 yards, the enemy broke into a run. At 10 yards, the air cracked open. The jungle erupted. Machine guns thundered, their barrels flashing in rhythmic bursts. The first Japanese ranks collapsed instantly, torn apart by the crossfire. Those behind stumbled over bodies, falling under the next wave of fire. Within seconds, the charge disintegrated into chaos. The Japanese officers shouted for regrouping, but the jungle was a wall of noise. Mortar shells rained down, exploding in orange flashes that lit the leaves like torches. Fragments tore through trees, shredding men and roots alike. The Rangers never shouted. They spoke in hand signals, short bursts of orders, their voices lost beneath the storm. The gun crews fired in practiced rhythm, 20 seconds on, 10 seconds to reload. Riflemen took down any target that moved through the gaps. At the perimeter's edge, Sergeant Schaefer fired his bar until the barrel smoked, the recoil bruising his shoulder. He shifted positions between bursts. keeping the enemy guessing where the fire was coming from. His assistant gunner crawled up beside him, replacing the magazine without a word. In the center, Lieutenant Green's section manned 2 Brownings side by side. Their tracers cut through the morning fog, turning the clearing into a deadly red strobe. Every 5th round was a tracer, every 5th round a heartbeat. The Japanese tried flanking maneuvers, crawling through the brush, attempting to strike from the rear. The Rangers anticipated it. A small reserve unit pivoted and unleashed rifle grenades that exploded in a semicircle, breaking the encirclement before it began. Then came the second bugle, a signal for a full banzai assault. It was 7:18 a.m. Nearly 300 men rose from the jungle and rushed forward, shouting, bayonets flashing in the new sun. It was the kind of sight that could freeze a man. But not these men. The Rangers shifted fire, opening up every weapon they had. The mortars launched shell after shell, the explosions rolling like thunder. One Browning jammed. Its gunner calmly cleared the feed, wiped the belt, and fired again without missing a beat. Grenades flew in arcs like comets. Riflemen dropped targets so close they could see the whites of their eyes. The first wave hit the wire and never crossed it. When the last explosion faded, the ground was carpeted with silence. The jungle steamed with the heat of gunfire. Birds had vanished. Even the insects were gone. The Rangers didn't relax. They scanned the trees, waiting for the next sound. When it came, a single rifle shot from the ridge. 3 Garands answered instantly, returning fire with mechanical precision. It lasted exactly 30 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the Rangers began to count. The ground outside their perimeter was a ruin of uniforms, weapons, and bodies. Over 500 enemy dead in that half hour. A small group of men had erased an entire battalion, and as the last echoes faded down the valley, the only sound left was the slow click of weapons cooling in the sun. The Japanese commander was dead. The survivors melted into the jungle, leaving their fallen behind. The Rangers didn't chase. They didn't cheer. They just sat, the adrenaline draining out of them like the rain. In the distance, smoke curled above the trees, the sign of a fight finished but not forgotten. They had done what few units in any war ever had. They had turned being surrounded into an advantage. The jungle was silent again, but it was not peace. It was exhaustion. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air like smoke after a forest fire. The ground steamed. Spent shells glittered in the mud. The Rangers sat in their foxholes, motionless, staring at the destruction they had just unleashed. For 30 minutes, they had been machines. Now they were men again, breathing, shaking, trying to understand what they'd survived. Sergeant Schaefer finally spoke, his voice a low rasp. "If this isn't hell, I don't know what is." They moved cautiously, checking positions, counting who was still alive. Out of 120 men, they had lost only 5. A miracle, or something close to it. Outside the perimeter, the sight was unreal. The Japanese battalion had been annihilated. Hundreds of bodies lay tangled in the vines, bayonets still clutched in hands that would never move again. Rifles were jammed into tree trunks from the force of explosions. Helmets floated in the puddles that filled shell craters. Somewhere beyond the smoke, a few survivors staggered back into the jungle. None looked back. When reinforcements arrived later that afternoon, they found the valley still burning. They expected to see the Rangers wiped out. Instead, they found them standing amid wreckage, eyes hollow, uniforms blackened. The men didn't speak. They simply nodded toward the dead. The senior officer in the relief unit, Major William Chandler, later wrote in his report, "I've seen battles before. I've never seen control like that. Not panic, not rage, control." The Japanese had walked into a trap not of wire or mines, but of discipline. Word spread quickly through the American lines. Whispers turned into stories. Some called it the 30-minute massacre. Others called it Mucci's miracle. To the Rangers, it was neither. It was survival, paid for in precision, patience, and nerve. But to the Japanese command, it was something else entirely. When reports reached higher headquarters, officers refused to believe them at first. They could not imagine that a small patrol had inflicted such losses. Their doctrine, built on the invincibility of spirit, had been shattered by the cold mechanics of strategy. Captured diaries from survivors spoke of confusion and disbelief. One soldier wrote, "The Americans did not fight like men. They fought like thunder." The myth of Japanese invincibility, the faith that numbers and courage could always prevail, had taken another blow. The Rangers had shown that fire discipline and intelligence could destroy even the most fanatical charge. That day's engagement became a study in contrast. Two armies facing each other with opposite philosophies. On one side, the Imperial Japanese Army, trained to overwhelm, to attack without hesitation, to die for the Emperor. On the other, a handful of Americans trained to think, to wait, and to strike when it mattered most. The result was history written in 30 minutes. For the next week, the 6th Ranger Battalion pushed deeper into Luzon. Everywhere they went, resistance faltered. The Japanese avoided direct contact, choosing ambushes over open attacks. They had learned their lesson, too late. At headquarters, Colonel Mucci was ordered to submit a full report. His account was clinical, almost detached. The enemy initiated encirclement. Our units held fire until within 25 yards. Result: 500 enemy KIA, minimal own losses. No triumph, no bravado, just numbers. But for those who had been there, the memory would never leave. Private McGuire later said, "When the shooting stopped, it was so quiet, it scared you. That's when you realized what you'd done." They buried their dead, patched their wounds, and cleaned their weapons. The next day, they were ordered to move out. There was no ceremony. There never was. In the following months, the story of Luzon spread beyond the Pacific. In training camps from Hawaii to the States, Ranger instructors taught new recruits the Luzon pattern, a defensive formation based on interlocking fields of fire, discipline under encirclement, and controlled counter-assaults. It became doctrine, a blueprint for small unit warfare that would echo through Korea and Vietnam decades later. The Japanese called it a massacre. The Americans called it a lesson. But for the 120 men who lived through it, it was simply the day the jungle stopped breathing. When they marched out, the valley behind them was still smoldering. Rain began to fall again, hissing against the hot metal of the guns. Steam rose in columns like ghosts. The Rangers didn't look back. They had walked into the heart of death and left it behind. When the report reached headquarters on Leyte, few believed it at first. 120 men, 5 casualties, 500 enemy dead. The math didn't make sense until the photographs arrived. Black and white images showed what the jungle couldn't hide: shredded trees, mangled weapons, and the neat discipline of foxholes that had not been overrun. The story was true. Word spread fast through the Pacific Command. The Luzon engagement became a case study almost overnight, a model of how a small, disciplined unit could survive encirclement through control, not chaos. Colonel Mucci, when debriefed, explained it simply. We weren't trapped. We were patient. That single line became legend. The U.S. Army's analysis team reconstructed every second of the 30-minute fight. They charted firing arcs, ammunition use, and casualty distribution. What they discovered stunned even their strategists. Nearly 70% of Japanese casualties occurred within the first 7 minutes. The rest came during retreat and counterfire. Proof that the Rangers' opening volley had been perfectly timed and ruthlessly efficient. Training manuals soon cited the battle under a new doctrine called controlled perimeter defense. It emphasized restraint, overlapping fire, and the psychological patience to let the enemy come too close before responding. The Luzon engagement became required study for Ranger and infantry officers across the Pacific. But for the men who lived it, the memory wasn't strategy. It was survival burned into the senses. Many Rangers would later speak of the strange silence that followed the fight, the way sound returned slowly. A dripping branch, a rattling casing, the slow hiss of smoke. The way men's hands kept reloading empty rifles because their bodies refused to stop. One medic recalled, "It was so quiet, you could hear the mosquitoes again." That's when you realized how many weren't breathing anymore. The cost of victory could not be measured in numbers alone. Every man carried something invisible back from that ridge. The sight of faces too close, the sound of impact too near, the knowledge that 30 minutes could change a lifetime. Still, there was pride, not in killing, but in discipline. They had done what every soldier was taught and few could achieve. Fight without fear, fire without panic, win without collapse. When General Walter Kruger, commander of the 6th Army, heard of the action, he personally commended the battalion. The discipline of these Rangers exemplifies what makes our Army unconquerable. For the Japanese, the loss was more than tactical. It was psychological. Reports from intercepted communications showed confusion and disbelief. Officers questioned how such a small American force could annihilate a full-strength unit in open ground. One Japanese analyst called it a defeat by silence, the most dishonorable kind. The Imperial Army's doctrine, built on speed and shock, had met its natural enemy: patience. For the rest of the Luzon campaign, Japanese forces avoided direct confrontations with American Ranger patrols. They began relying more on ambushes and night raids, tactics that demanded stealth over ferocity. It was an unspoken admission that something fundamental had shifted. The balance of fear in the jungle had changed. The victory on Luzon didn't make headlines. It was too small, too brutal, too personal. But within the tight circles of the U.S. Army's Special Operations world, it became legend. Colonel Mucci's Rangers carried the reputation forward. Within months, they would go on to perform one of the most daring rescues in World War II. The Cabanatuan Raid, freeing more than 500 Allied POWs from Japanese captivity. The discipline they had forged in that 30-minute stand made the raid possible. They knew how to move unseen. They knew how to hold fire until it mattered. They knew how to turn fear into calculation. Commanders who studied the Luzon fight understood something deeper than tactics. They saw the evolution of American warfare, a transition from brute force to precision, from volume to intent. The Pacific had been a proving ground for endurance, but battles like this one proved that intellect, coordination, And trust could be just as lethal as raw firepower. When war correspondents eventually heard about the encounter, they tried to paint it as a miracle. One company defeats a battalion. But the Rangers rejected that description. Miracles were accidents. This wasn't one. It was method, discipline, and courage working in unison. The very qualities that defined the American fighting spirit. Yet, away from the reports and commendations, the personal cost was immense. Men who survived often found it hard to sleep through silence. Loud noises didn't startle them. Silence did. The jungle had taught them to equate stillness with danger. Private Leo Perez once said, "When it got quiet back home, I could hear the jungle again. It never leaves you." Some carried the weight quietly for the rest of their lives. They didn't speak about the bodies or the blood, only the teamwork, the machine of men that had worked perfectly when it had to. For many, that became their pride, that in humanity's most chaotic state, they had remained composed. The Luzon battle became part of Ranger mythology, passed down not as a tale of slaughter, but of control under pressure. It taught generations that the key to survival was not strength alone, but restraint. Years later, when the Korean War erupted, instructors at Fort Benning still taught Luzon pattern defense to new recruits. They called it the art of stillness. In Japan, the story was remembered differently. Officers who studied the defeat referred to it as the day the jungle betrayed us. They believed nature itself had favored the Americans, that the fog, terrain, and timing were too perfect to be coincidence. But history shows it wasn't luck. It was design. By the end of 1945, the war was over. The men who fought that morning returned home to farms, factories, and quiet lives. Few ever spoke about what they'd done, but in the small circles of those who knew, the Luzon battle remained sacred, not for its body count, but for what it revealed about courage. That real bravery is not in charging forward, but in waiting, heart steady, finger poised, until the moment comes. That's how 120 men stood still in a storm, and became the storm. War remembers its explosions, the great offensives, the thunder of artillery, the sound of victory tearing through the air. But sometimes, history's truest victories are won in silence. On that nameless ridge in Luzon, 120 Rangers didn't fight for fame or for history books. They fought for each other, quietly, efficiently, without panic. They let the enemy surround them. They waited. They endured. And then, in 30 minutes of ordered chaos, they turned a trap into a triumph. What made it remarkable wasn't just the scale. 500 enemy dead, 5 of their own lost. It was how it happened. Through patience, through discipline, through the refusal to break. That morning redefined what it meant to be strong. It wasn't about charging forward with blind courage. It was about standing still with perfect control. When historians look back on the Pacific War, they often write about machines, the ships, the bombs, the planes that ended empires. But the true power of America's war effort wasn't built in factories. It was built in moments like Luzon, in the quiet confidence of soldiers who trusted their training more than their fear. The Japanese came believing they were chasing prey. They left knowing they had faced predators, and in that transformation lies the essence of the U.S. Ranger Creed, not to seek glory, but to earn it through endurance. Long after the gunfire faded, the lesson of Luzon remained. Patience can be deadlier than rage. Discipline can be louder than war cries. And silence, when held with purpose, can be the sound of victory. Today, when you stand in a field or jungle that once burned with fury, the wind still carries echoes of that truth. No trumpets, no speeches, just the faint hum of a world that remembers the day when a few men surrounded by death refused to move, and by doing nothing, won everything.